Now it's been rather painstakingly and elaborately demonstrated to the satisfaction of most people, I don't want to just use arguments from authority, but it's not very much contested anymore, that we are not designed as creatures, but that we evolved by a rather laborious combination of random mutation and natural selection into the species that we are today. It is, of course, open to the faithful to say that all this was, now that they come to know it, now that it becomes available to everybody, now that they think about it, and now that they've stopped opposing it or trying to ban it, then they can say, actually, on second thought, the evolution was all part of the design.
Now, he did make some remarks about the theory of evolution, which at least insinuated that this was somehow incompatible with theism. And I have 2 points to make about this. First, I think that the theory of biological evolution is simply irrelevant to the truth of Christian theism. Genesis 1 admits all manner of different interpretations, and one is by no means committed to six-day creationism. Howard Van Til, who is a professor at Calvin College, writes, "Is the concept of special creation required of all persons who trust in the Creator God of Scripture? Most Christians in my acquaintance who are engaged with either scientific or biblical scholarship have concluded that the special creationist picture of the world's formation is not a necessary component of Christian belief. Nor is this a retreat caused by modern science. St. Augustine in the AD 300s, in his commentary on Genesis, pointed out that the days don't need to be taken literally, nor need the creation be a few thousand years ago. Indeed, he suggested that God made the world with certain special potencies that would gradually unfold over time and develop. And this interpretation came 1,500 years before Darwin, so that it is not a forced retreat in the face of modern science. So any doubts that I would have about the theory of biological evolution would be not biblical, but rather scientific. Namely, what it imagines is fantastically improbable. Barrow and Tipler, 2 physicists, in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, list 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star and incinerated the Earth. And they calculate the probability of the evolution of the human genome to be somewhere between 4 to the negative 180th power to the 110,000th power, and 4 to the negative 360th power to the 110,000th power. So if evolution did occur on this planet, it was literally a miracle, and therefore evidence for the existence of God. So I don't think this is an argument for atheism, quite the contrary. It really provides good grounds for thinking that God superintended the process of biological development. So the Christian can be open to the evidence to follow it where it leads. By contrast, as Alvin Plantinga has said, for the naturalist, evolution is the only game in town. No matter how fantastic the odds, no matter how improbable, it's got to be true, because there is no intelligent creator and designer. So in one sense, you've got to feel a little sorry for the atheist. He can't really follow the evidence where it leads. His presuppositions determine the outcome. By contrast, if there is a fine-tuner and creator of the universe, then already in the initial conditions of the Big Bang, you have an elaborately designed universe that permits the evolution and existence of intelligent life. And I think evolution simply layers on more improbability.
I invite you to look up the very alarming and beautiful and brilliant account by the National Geographic's coordinator of the Genome Project. By the way, you should send in your little sample from the inside of your cheek and have your African ancestry traced. It's absolutely fascinating to follow the mitochondrial DNA that we all have in common and that we have in common with other species, other primates, and other life forms. You have to be able to imagine that all this randomness is the will of a being. You are absolutely free to believe that if you wish. And all of this should happen so that one very imperfect race of evolved primates should have the opportunity to become Christians or to turn up at this gym tonight. That all of that was done with us in view. It's a curious kind of solipsism. It's a curious kind of self-centeredness. I was always brought up to believe that Christians were modest and humble and comported themselves with due humility. And there's a certain arrogance to this assumption that all of this All of this extraordinary development was all about us. And we were the intended and designed result, and everything else was in the discard. The tremendous wastefulness of it, the tremendous caprice of it, the tremendous tinkering and incompetence of it, never mind. At least we're here, and we can be people of faith. It doesn't work for me, I have to simply say that, and I think there may be questions of psychology involved in this as well. Believe it if you can. I can't stop you. Believe it if you like. You're welcome.
Now, Mr. Hitchens says, but why did God wait so long, all that waste during this time? Well, that sort of concern with efficiency is only of importance to someone with either limited time or limited resources, or both. But in the case of God, he has both unlimited resources and unlimited time, and therefore it's simply not important to do this in a quick way.
You cannot get from deism to theism except by a series of extraordinarily generous to yourself assumptions. The deist has all his work still ahead of him.
Now, what about my arguments for theism? Mr. Hitchens had some general remarks here. He says it's difficult to get from deism to theism. Now, I want to point out that's a false use of these terms. This is simply confused. Deism is a type of theism. Theism is the broad worldview that God exists. Deism is a specific kind of theism that says God has not revealed himself directly in the world. Now, my arguments are a cumulative case for Christian theism. They add up to the belief in the God that has been revealed by Jesus of Nazareth.
How are we going to square the new cosmology, the fantastic new discoveries in physics, with the old dogmas? Well, one is the idea of this fine-tuning. This is essentially another form of pattern seeking on the basis of extremely limited evidence. Most physicists are very uncertain about the spatio-temporal dimensions of the original episode, the Big Bang as it's sometimes called. We're in the very, very early stages of this inquiry. We hardly know what we don't know about the origins of the universe. We're viewing it from an unimaginable distance, not just an unimaginable distance in space. We're perched on a tiny rock in an extremely small suburb of a fairly minor galaxy, trying to look to discern our origins, but also at an unbelievable distance in time. And we claim the right to say, we can see the finger of God in this process. It's an extraordinarily arrogant assumption.
Here he said, well, scientists are terribly uncertain about the fine-tuning argument. Well, I think that's simply not the case. Sir Martin Rees, the Royal Astronomer Royal of Great Britain, has said, the laws governing our universe appear to be finely tuned for our existence. Everywhere you look, there are yet more examples. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. Ernest McMullen, philosopher of science, says it seems safe to say that later theory, no matter how different it may be, will turn up approximately the same numbers. And the numerous constraints that have to be imposed on these numbers seem both too specific and too numerous to evaporate entirely. So that it's very unlikely that this fine-tuning is going to vanish or be explained away.
Let me make tiny, quick objections to it as it stands, and I'm no more a physicist than most of you are. I'll make these lay objections. One, was there pre-existing material for this extra spatio-temporal being to work with? Or did he just will it into existence, the ex nihilo?
He asked was the question, was there pre-existent material? The answer is no, there was not. As Barrow and Tipler point out, at this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity. So if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo, that is, out of nothing. And this isn't talking religion, folks. This is talking contemporary cosmology.
Why are there so many shooting stars, collapsed suns, failed galaxies? We can see with the aid of a telescope. Sometimes we can see with the naked eye. The utter failure, the total destruction of gigantic, unimaginable sweeps of outer space. Is this fine-tuning, or is it extremely random, capricious, cruel, mysterious, and incompetent? And have you thought of the nothingness that's coming? We know we have something now, and we speculate about what it might have come from, and there's a real question about ex nihilo, but nihilo is coming to us. In the night sky, you can already see the Andromeda Galaxy. It's heading straight for ours on a collision course. Is that part of a design? Was it fine-tuned to do that? We know that from the red light shift of the Hubble telescope, or rather Edwin Hubble's original discovery, the universe is expanding away from itself at a tremendous rate. It was thought that rate would go down for Newtonian reasons. No, it's recently been proved by Professor Lawrence Krauss, the rate of expansion is increasing. Everything is exploding away even faster. Nothingness is certainly coming. Who designed that? And that's all if before these things happen, we don't have the destruction of our own little solar system, in which already there's only one planet where anything like life can possibly be supported. All the other planets are too hot or too cold to support any life at all, and the sun is due to swell up, burn us to a crisp, boil our oceans and die, as we've seen all the other suns do in the night sky. This is not fine-tuning, ladies and gentlemen, and if it's the work of a designer, then there's an indictment to which that designer may have to be subjected.
Now, Mr. Hitchens responds, but we're headed toward nothingness. We're ultimately going to be doomed, and therefore the universe is not designed. Well, now, this is not a very powerful objection. The temporal duration of something is irrelevant to whether it's been designed. The products of human intelligence and engineering, like computers and automobiles, will eventually decay and cease to exist, but that doesn't mean they weren't designed. I think the real objection he's getting at here is, why would God create mankind only to have it go extinct? But of course, you see, on the Christian view, that's false. That is an atheistic assumption. On the Christian view, life does not end at the grave, and God has given assurance of this by raising Jesus from the dead. So the objection simply has no purchase against Christian theism.
You have to imagine, let's say the human species has been, Homo sapiens has been with us. Some people say as long as 250,000 years. Some say 200, some say 100,000. Francis Collins and Richard Dawkins oscillate about this. It's not a very big argument. I'll just take 100,000, if you like. Their life expectancy for the first, I don't know, many, many tens of thousands of years would be lucky to be in the 20s. And for 98,000 years or so, heaven watches this with complete indifference. And then, we know where your children go to school, by the way. Heaven watches this with total indifference, and then, with 2,000 years to go on the clock, thinks, actually, it's time we intervened. We can't go on like this. Why don't we have someone tortured to death in Bronze Age Palestine? That should teach them. That should give them the chance of redemption. You're free to believe that, but I think the designer who thought of doing it that way was a very cruel, capricious, random, bungling, and incompetent one.
Well, now, Mr. Hitchens says, but why did God wait so long before he sent Christ? Human beings have existed for thousands of years on this planet before Christ's coming. Well, what's really crucial here is not the time involved, rather it's the population of the world. The Population Reference Bureau estimates that the number of people who have ever lived on this planet is about 105 billion people. Only 2% of them were born prior to the advent of Christ. Eric Krapes of the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research says, God's timing couldn't have been more perfect. Christ showed up just before the exponential explosion in the world's population. The Bible says, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. And when Christ came, the nation of Israel had been prepared. The Roman peace dominated the Mediterranean world. It was an age of literacy and learning. The stage was set for the advent of God's Son into the world. And I think in God's providential plan for human history, we see the wisdom of God in orchestrating the development of human life, and then in bringing Christ into the world in the fullness of time. So I don't see that there are any good grounds here for thinking that this provides reason for atheism.
Doctor, you said that N.T. Wright, who's an impressive person, says that no explanation of the success of Christianity is possible that doesn't rest on the terms of its being true. In other words, Wright says it was so successful, it must have been, and the people were so strongly motivated to believe it that it must have been true. I regard that as a very, very unsafe assumption. Or if it is a safe one, then it must surely apply to Islam. and to Mormonism. I mean, these are two very, very, very fast-growing religions, have people prepared to sacrifice enormously for it, have ancestors who were absolutely determined of the truth of it at the time, and who made extraordinary conquests in its name. If you're going to grant this for one religion, it seems to me you have to be willing, not just willing, you may indeed be compelled to make this concession for all of them. And that, I think, would be not just an unsafe assumption, but for most of you here, a distinctly unwelcome one.
What about the resurrection of Jesus? Here he misunderstood N.T. Wright's argument. N.T. Wright's argument is not that the success of Christianity means that it's true. That would apply to Islam and Mormonism. Rather, N.T. Wright's argument is that the origin of the disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead is so un-Jewish, it is so uncharacteristic, that you have to explain what would bring them to adopt so radical a mutation of Jewish belief as belief in a dying Messiah and a rising Messiah. And he says the only thing he can think of that would explain this is the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And that's why Wright concludes that these have a certainty that is comparable to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So you've got to get the argument right if you're going to deal with it. And in fact, I think the only explanation of these facts is the one the disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead.
I'm interested that the word objective morality is the one that Dr. Craig chooses. Usually arguments about morality are whether morality is, so to say, absolute or whether it's relative. As to objectivity, I think it's a very good compromise word, by the way, and I'm very happy to accept it. But the problem with morality is this, in respect of religion. You can't prove that anyone behaves any better if they refer this problem upward to a supreme dictator of a celestial kind.
Now, what about the moral argument? Here he says that you have to prove that people would behave better if they believed in God. That's not the argument. I hope that's clear to everyone. The argument is that without God as a transcendent foundation for moral values, we're simply lost in sociocultural relativism. Who are you to judge that the Nazi ethic was wrong? Who are you to judge that the ethic of ancient Hinduism was wrong? Who are you to judge that the Afrikaner apartheid is wrong? This is all just the result of sociocultural evolution, and there is no transcendent objective standard apart from God, and that's what God delivers for us.
There are two questions that I've asked in public, and I'll try them again, because I try them on every audience. They're very simple ones. First, you have to name for me, or challenges, let's say, rather than questions. You have to name for me an ethical action or an ethical statement or moral action, moral statement made or undertaken by a believer that I couldn't undertake or say, I couldn't state or do. I haven't yet had an example pointed out of that to me. In other words, that a person of faith would have an advantage by being able to call upon divine sanction. Whereas if I ask you to think of a wicked act undertaken by someone in the name of God or because of their faith, you wouldn't have, or a wicked statement made, you wouldn't have that much difficulty, I think, in coming up with an example right away. The genital mutilation community, for example, is almost exclusively religious. The suicide bombing community is almost exclusively religious. There's simply no way of deriving morality and ethics from the supernatural.
Now, Mr. Hitchens says, name one moral action that an unbeliever could not take. Well, that's trivially easy. If God exists, there are all kinds of moral duties that we have that the unbeliever could not recognize. At the panel discussion last week in Dallas, when Mr. Hitchens demanded that someone name such an action, a pastor on the panel immediately piped up, "How about tithing?" Well, leave it to a pastor to think of that, but clearly that's an action that only a believer would take. Even more fundamentally, what about the first and greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your mind. That is an action that only a believer can take. No unbeliever can discharge even this most fundamental of moral duties.
When we come to the question of the absolute, well, the most often cited one is the golden rule, the one that almost everyone feels they have in common, the injunction not to do to others as you wouldn't want them to do to you. This doesn't, in fact, come from the Sermon on the Mount or from Christianity, or it doesn't originate with it. It's certainly adumbrated by Rabbi Hillel, a Babylonian rabbi, and it's to be found in the Analects of Confucius too, but it has, since we're talking about objective, relative, and absolute, a crucial weakness in it, unfortunately. We'd like to be able to follow it, but it's only really as good as the person who's uttering it. In other words, if I say, I won't treat you as I don't want you to treat me, what am I to do when confronted with Charles Manson? I want him treated in a way that I wouldn't want to be treated myself. Anything else would surely be completely relativistic. So the argument isn't at all advanced by saying that I couldn't know any of this. I couldn't have any moral promptings. I couldn't decide for myself if I see a pregnant woman being kicked in the stomach, that because she's pregnant, that's obviously worse than if it was just a woman who wasn't pregnant being kicked in the stomach. This is part of my patrimony as a human being. It's part of the essential emotional solidarity that I need to have with my fellow creatures to make us realize that we are brothers and sisters, one with another. We are dependent upon each other, have expectations of one another, and that if we didn't have these and try and fulfill them, we couldn't have got as far as we have. We couldn't have ever had a society. There's never been a society found where rape and murder and perjury are not condemned. And these moral discoveries long, or absolutes if you want to call them that, long predate the arrival of anything recognizable as monotheism. And it seems to me also that there's something degrading in the idea of saying that morality comes from on high, that we ourselves are not good enough, that we don't have the dignity, we don't have the self-respect, we don't have the character to know a right action or a right statement when we see it or when we want to perform it. It's this servile element in religion. It's not, strictly speaking, the subject of our debate this evening, I know, but I'm damned if I completely forego it. It's the idea that buried in the religious impulse is actually the wish to be unfree, is the wish for an immovable, unchangeable, celestial authority, a kind of heavenly North Korea that will take our decisions away from us and commit us only to worship and praise and thank a great leader and his son, the dear leader, forever and ever and ever.
All of this is beside the point with respect to the moral argument. The point is that on atheism, there are no moral obligations for anybody to fulfill. In nature, whatever is right, and Mr. Hitchens is unable to provide any sort of objective foundation for moral values. Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher of biology. This is what he has to say. He says, on atheism, there is no such thing as objective morality. Morality in human cultures has evolved, and what is moral for you might not be moral for the guy next door, and certainly is not moral for the guy across the ocean. And what makes you think that your personal morality is the one and everybody else is wrong? What we call homicide or rape, he said, is very, very common among different kinds of animals. Lions, for example, commit infanticide on a regular basis. Now, are these kinds of acts to be condoned? I don't even know what that means because the lion doesn't understand what morality is. Morality, he says, is an invention of human beings. It's just a convention that human beings have adopted to live together, but it has no objectivity. And that's what I offer Mr. Hitchens tonight, is a solid, transcendent foundation for the moral values that I think he so desperately wants to affirm.
I think it's you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it's Tertullian, isn't it, who says something like, it's variously translated, credo quia absurdum, that the very improbability of the thing, the very unlikelihood of it, the unlikelihood that anyone would fabricate such a thing, for example, that a Jew could be brought to believe something so extraordinary, is testimony to its truth. I'm sure there can't be anyone who doesn't think that's a little too easy, a little too facile.
The argument is not that it's too improbable to be false. The argument is that you need a historically sufficient explanation to explain why the disciples came to believe this. And there isn't one apart from the empty tomb and appearances. It's not a matter of rumor because the empty tomb was public knowledge in Jerusalem. It would be impossible for Christianity to flourish in Jerusalem in the face of an occupied tomb.
It hasn't been shown that I couldn't be a moral person despite my unbelief, and it has certainly not been demonstrated that unbelief will guarantee you against, the belief will, I'll say it again, that unbelief will ensure you against wickedness. And the third member of the Axis, the Japanese empire, was led by someone who actually claimed he was himself a god, and to whom everyone in Japan was a serf and had to admit his godhead and divinity. And it was said to all of them, where would we know without the emperor? How would we know what to do? How would we know what a right action was? Without him, there would be screwing in the streets. There would be chaos. No one would know their bearings. Without our God, we would be rudderless. Many Japanese people, in fact, it's pitiful to report, still actually believe that.
We saw that without God, there are no objective moral values. And here Mr. Hitchens has consistently distorted the argument. He's portrayed the argument as, how would we know moral values if we didn't believe in God? We don't need to believe in a tyrant in order to find moral values. Unbelief doesn't produce wickedness. That is all irrelevant. The point is that there is no foundation on a naturalistic worldview for the moral values and duties that we both want to affirm. And he agrees with that. This is what he says, and I quote. He says, our innate predisposition to both good and wicked behavior is precisely what one would expect to find of a recently evolved species that is half a chromosome away from chimpanzees. Primate and elephant and even pig societies show considerable evidence of care for others, parent-child bonding, solidarity in the face of danger, and so on. As Darwin put it, any animal whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well developed as in man. That is the sociobiological explanation of morality. The problem is that moral sense that develops in pig societies, chimpanzees, baboons, and Homo sapiens is illusory on atheism, because there are no objective moral duties or values that we have to fulfill, and that's what the theist can offer Mr. Hitchens. And so I want to invite Mr. Hitchens to think about becoming a Christian tonight. Honestly, he wants to affirm objective moral values, so why not adopt theism?
Look, there are things that if people do, incest is one, and cannibalism is another. If you do them, you'll die out. A society that permitted it would. There were societies in New Guinea that did practice cannibalism, and there's a terrible disease that you get called kuru if you do it, and it seems to be. If you like, there are some rules that are self-enforcing. That's not what when I was talking about sexual repression, I was talking about the enormous number of prohibitions on sex between men and women.
Apart from God, whatever is in nature is right. There is no thing barred in nature if there is no sort of objective moral code. So here is a guideline for sexual expression that is very good for human beings and not something that's meant to be repressive or harmful to human beings. In fact, the studies I've seen says that religious people have more fun with sex than people who are not religious. And it's actually shows that they are more sexually satisfied in marriage and so forth.
My suspicion is, if you really ask the religious, where do they want power? And what's the world they care about? The next one or this one? It'll be this one every time, because they too know perfectly well that this is the only life we've got.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. It seems to me that on the basis of the resurrection of Jesus, that we have grounds for the hope of immortality. This is the foundation upon which the Christian hope is predicated. So again, it gets back to whether or not one has good grounds for thinking that Jesus was who he claimed to be and that God raised him from the dead. Because if he did, then there is hope of immortality.
But then I return your question to me, I return it to you in a different form. If there's going to be a resurrection, an ingathering, if in the end all injustices will be cancelled, all tears dried, all the other promises kept, then why do you care what happens in this brief veil of tears? Why do the churches want power in the here and now? Why do they want to legislate for things like abortion or sexuality or morality? Why bother? I mean, isn't it just as much the case, as Dostoevsky says about atheism, that without God all things are possible, that with God all things are thinkable too?
Not at all. As Dostoevsky said, if there is no immortality, all things are permitted, he said, because it all ends up the same, it all comes out in the wash the same. But if there is a God who exists, who loves human beings and has created them in his image and endowed them with intrinsic moral value and unalienable rights, then you have every reason to treasure other persons as ends in themselves. And the desire of pro-life persons to champion the lives of the unborn or the lives of the dying isn't a power grab, Mr. Hitchens. It's because they genuinely care about the lives of innocent human beings that they believe are being wantonly destroyed. So it's a very positive motivation.
Agreed, but there are perfectly good humanist motives for doing all those things, and if you want to have a reason for caring about the survival and health and well-being of others, the idea that you might depend on them for the only life you've got, and they on you for solidarity, is just as good an explanation for right action. But per contra, if people think God is telling them what to do, or they have God on their side, what will they not do? That's what I meant by the reversal of the Dostoevsky question. What crime will not be committed? What offense to justice and to reason and to humanity is not regularly committed by people who are convinced that it is God's will that they do that?
If they commit such atrocities, it is only because they act inconsistently with their worldview rather than in line with it. Jesus would not have been a guard at Auschwitz or someone who would take away the human rights of another person. You need to ask what kinds of actions are sanctioned by a worldview. And on atheism, as Dostoevsky said, it seems everything is permitted. Humanism, without God as a basis for humanism, is just a form of speciesism, a bias in favor of your own species. I think Christianity affirms the real basis for humanism.
Auschwitz is the outcome of centuries in which the Christian church believed that the Jewish people had called for the blood of Jesus of Nazareth to be on their head for every generation. It's only in one verse in the Bible, I know, but it happens to be the verse the church picked up on. I don't say Jesus would have been a guard there. That's not the point. The point is that this is not an aberration of religion. It is a scriptural injunction, as is the one to kill the Amalekites, as is the one to mutilate the genitals of children.
The issue is, would Jesus have been a guard at Auschwitz? Because insofar as people who claim to be his followers were guards at Auschwitz, they were acting inconsistently and in defiance of the ethic of Jesus.
Why do you think so many people come out to see debates with accomplished people like Dr. Craig and you?
It's a time for this great question to come up again. I think there are two reasons for it. One is the emergence of a very aggressive theocratic challenge in various parts of the world. We are about to see a long-feared nightmare come true, the acquisition of apocalyptic weaponry by a messianic regime in Tehran. Which is already enslaving and ruining a formerly great civilization. We see the forces of Al-Qaeda and related jihadists ruining the societies of Iraq, of Afghanistan, Pakistan. We see Jewish settlers stealing other people's land in the name of God in the hope that this will bring on a messianic combat and the return of the Messiah. And even in our own country, we're not free from people who want to have stultifying nonsense taught to children in school and in science class. So there's that. It's in the news all the time. And then there's the existence of a very small group, of which I'm very proud to be a part, that says it's time to take a stand against theocratic bullying and is willing to go anywhere to debate these matters and put these great questions to the proof. So thank you for giving me the chance.
Yeah, I would answer the question somewhat differently. I think that what we're seeing is the fruit of modernity. In the Enlightenment, the church and the monarchy were thrown off in the name of free thought and unshackled human inquiry. And the thought was that once mankind was freed from the shackles and bondage of religion, that this would produce a sort of humanistic utopia. And instead, I think what we've come to see is that the fruit of the naturalistic worldview is that mankind is reduced to meaninglessness, valuelessness, and purposelessness. And that therefore the question of God's existence has become all the more poignant in our age because we're beginning to question, I think, the fruit of modernity and questioning scientific naturalism. I'm privileged to be part of a revolution in Christian philosophy that has been going on over the last half century that has literally transformed the face of Anglo-American philosophy. As the scientific, naturalistic, atheistic worldview has been challenged in the name of reason and philosophy, and the theistic worldview reasserted. And I believe that we're seeing a tremendous groundswell of interest among lay people as this revolution is beginning to filter down to the man in the street. So I would see us as beginning to question the assumptions of modernity and the bitter fruits of modernity that have been so evident in the 20th century. And I'm hoping that this will lead to a tremendous renaissance in Christian thinking and Christian faith.
To wrap up, then,